Hey, everybody, we got a special guest to talk to. A local guy, grew up, went to Fairport High, once a Raider. He's now in New York covering the Yankees and the Mets. And he's got a book that we're going to talk about. Andy Martino, welcome. And good to get a chance to talk to you about what you got going on.
Mike, it's great to be here, get a chance to talk to you and my fellow Rochesterians. It's been a while.
All right, let's start with the book. Here, I got the copy of it right here, The Yankee Way. And it's described as the untold inside story of the Brian Cashman era. We got a lot to talk about with Cashman. Let's just start okay, there's different ways to write a book. You can write a biography, you can write just about him, you can get his support. How did you get this done? And what was it like getting Cashman to, at least in this case, talk to you and contribute to the book?
Well, that part actually wasn't easy, Mike, and I thought it would be because I've known Brian Cashman through covering him for quite a while now, more than a decade, about a decade and a half covering baseball in New York. And we have a professional collegial relationship. I think fair to say that we get along fine for reporter and general manager. So I looked at the Yankees and his run of power in the Yankees, which has gone back to 1998, as a really interesting way to tell a story about the changes in the game. And when Cashman arrived as a Yankee intern in 1986, baseball was still in the pre-analytic, what they would consider the Stone Ages, pen and paper and old school scouting and all the things that, in some sense, have been lost. And now that he's still in charge in 2024, in the age of all kinds of data and analytics in modern sports, I thought he could be a vehicle to tell the story of the trajectory of not just this world famous franchise, but the game itself over that time. So I approached him about it in 2021, and he ended up being really reluctant to open up. I think probably because he's still in the job, probably didn't want to give away any trade secrets. There are a lot of particulars in the game and in sports about being seen as a self promoter or taking a victory lap. He didn't want it to be seen as his book. But the way I ultimately convinced him to participate, and he ended up talking to me many times over the course of 2 years, and really, I think, opening up, is that I said, look, you always tell me that the story that's told about the history of the Yankees is wrong. And the heroes that everybody knows, Joe Torre and Derek Jeter, are only the surface of the success that this franchise has had. So let me tell what you think is the right story and help me do that. And ultimately, I convinced him, and he said, as long as you don't sell this as my memoir, which is what I wanted to do anyway, a work of journalism, he ended up participating and was ultimately very generous with his time, talking to me, as I said, over the course of 2 years.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about what he's like, because for a guy who has been in New York City for that long and is perceived or, accepted by a lot of people, Billy Beane, you mentioned that, everybody knows Moneyball, thinks he's the GOAT, the greatest of all
Yeah.
time. It's quite a relationship with the fans because he's been there so long, and many, my age, people that have followed the Yankees were used to so much change and so much change. And here's Brian Cashman in there for that long. How do you rank him as a person who's looked at him and then talked to him for this? And do you think he's perceived as that by the majority of Yankee fans?
I think that's a great question, Mike. The difference between how he's perceived within the industry, meaning his competitors, his peers, and the journalists generally who cover him, versus Yankee fans, there's a tremendous gulf there, a tremendous difference in the way he's perceived in the moment. I think history will perceive him ultimately, fans, whenever he's gone, will look back on this as a great era of Yankee baseball, even though, of course, they'd like to be in the World Series a little more often, which they're used to in the past. But what rivals see, and what I have to acknowledge too, and being an objective observer of this, is the fact that he's been the general manager since 1998, and the Yankees have never finished a season with a losing record. This is something that is held in awe, which is not too strong a term, and the people who compete against him. If you look at the course of any franchise, even the successful ones, the Red Sox, the Dodgers, I could go on. They take a step back sometimes. They rebuild or they retool, and the Yankees don't have the luxury of doing that in their market. They have a season in which they're 82 and 80 in 2023, came close to breaking that winning record streak. Cashman called it a disaster. Fans were chanting "Fire Cashman" at the stadium toward the end of that season. That is perceived as a failure because the standard for Yankee baseball is so high. The Yankees talk about championships as being part of their brand. They have earned a lot of these high expectations and brought them on themselves. But the fact is, when you're toiling away in baseball operations, as any GM is, and you're winning every single year, that's why a Billy Beane, as you mentioned, who is no question because of Moneyball, the most famous GM of all time, told me Brian Cashman's the greatest executive in the history of this sport. So that tells you how he's perceived by the people who are trying to do the same thing and often failing.
You know, he's a guy that everybody has known that follows the Yankees, but he's not the day-to-day guy. He's not Joe Torre. He's not Aaron Boone in that way. And there's a lot of things in your book that I found really interesting. And, you know, I had no idea, didn't know Cashman's history, that his father dealt with George Steinbrenner. You tell those stories in the book. I love the fact that, okay, so I'm going to have you tell this story, how he ended up starting with the Yankees because he lost money gambling. Is this the right path here?
That's right. He was a ball player for Catholic University. He was a high contact, low on base percentage guy, so not someone that he would have drafted later in his career. Didn't walk enough for the Yankees, but yeah, he was down in South Florida playing in a tournament, a baseball tournament, and he lost all his money in a card game. So his father, who was an executive at Pompano Park, a famous racetrack then in Florida, in Fort Lauderdale area, told him, go see this guy. The guy's name was Alan Finkelson. He works at this park, and he'll spot you some money to eat and get home. So Cashman goes and sees this man, Alan Finkelson, looks around, and he says, what's all this Yankee memorabilia doing in your office? And Finkelson says, oh, I even have a Yankee ring. I'm best friends with George Steinbrenner, who was a big horse guy, which is how he came together occasionally with Cashman's father as well. And Finkelson said, well, what do you do in the summer? Cashman says, oh, I'm going to play in a summer league or something. I'll figure out something. And Finkelson says, well, how would you like an internship with the Yankees? And right there, the course of Brian Cashman's life, and probably more broadly, Yankee history itself changed. He said, oh, okay, I'll take an internship with the Yankees. And here we are 4 decades later, and he is still there.
It's funny you say that he took a internship with the Yankees. You mentioned in the book that his family was Yankee fans, and I vividly remember the 1978 World Series. My brother was a Dodgers fan. I grew up in Jersey, South Jersey, as a Yankees fan, and that 78 series, and he is a diehard Dodgers fan in that series. And here he is, not that much later, taking an internship with the Yankees.
He was even a Dodger bat boy in Vero Beach in spring training when he was young, which is his father had all these connections, baseball connections through the racetrack business. So Brian Cashman was a Dodger guy, and he is very traditional, almost old school, say taciturn person talking about his family. That was the hardest thing to get him to open up about. So I said, well, why are you a Dodger fan? And he just said, I had a Yankee family. I went my own way. Which, if you've ever seen a Brian Cashman press conference, is very Brian Cashman in the way that he answers it in that monotone way. And that was his way of forming a rebellion. But he's certainly been as much of a Yankee person as anyone could possibly be ever since the mid '80s. His loyalty to the Steinbrenner family, to that Yankee tradition and Yankee brand, has certainly grown over the years and solidified into something where he's in a job now that, in some ways, he's tried to leave at times and can't. So he certainly a dyed-in-the-wool Yankee guy by now. But you're right, he grew up a Dodger fan.
I apologize if in the background you can hear a little noise. This is just what happens sometimes. There is a little bit of work going on at the house here. So these guys are working hard. And so I think we can get through this. I want to go into the book a little bit because obviously a lot is based on Cashman. And listen, I said, I'm a kid. I'm watching the Yankees. I loved Bobby Mercer as a kid. Those teams were bad. I remember those players. And one of the guys I always remember is Gene Michael, the stick. I didn't have any real sense. I knew all the different roles Gene Michael had with the Yankees. But in your book, you describe some of the stuff about Gene Michael and his relationship with George. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, was Gene Michael the father of analytics? Did he start out going this is what's more important than what a lot of people see?
That is such a great question, Mike. And I think in his own intuitive way, without having the data and the spreadsheets in front of him, he absolutely was the father of analytics. For people that don't know the story, he was a shortstop in the 60s into the 70s. He got to the Yankees in the late 60s, just in time to play 1 year with Mickey Mantle. So this is someone who really arrived at the very end of that golden age of the Mickey Mantle Yankees and managed to stay until his death in 2017 when Aaron Judge was a rookie. So you think about this span of his presence in Yankee history. And he had an intuitive eye for the game and an eye for scouting that people have been talking about as long as I've been covering baseball. Oh, Gene Michael. Oh, he was a super scout. He had this genius eye. So I, for this book, dug into that and was asking people that scouted with him, like the former Yankees and Mets executive Billy Epler, who was close to G. Michael. Well, what does that mean? What was it like to scout with him? What did he see that other people didn't see? And people like Epler told me about he could look at a batter in the on-deck circle, like he did with the young Andrew McCutchen, and say, oh, this guy, look at the way he's watching the pitcher. Look at the way that he is quitting on the baseball when there's a ball thrown and not a strike, and he lowers his shoulders. G. Michael was able to notice these tiny things that showed what a player could be that most other scouts couldn't see. And he turned that into the idea of on-base percentage, which is obviously just a good eye enough to draw a walk. And this is prevalent in the game now, but wasn't in the 80s when if you drew a walk and you got on base, a walk is as good as a hit in terms of having a chance to score, having a chance to win the game. You talk about being the father of analytics. Billy Beane and Sandy Alderson were developing this in Oakland at the same time with much more of an academic methodology, looking at actual analytics. Bill James, who's the pioneer of analytics, and they ended up getting a lot of credit for that with the book and the movie. But as Buck Showalter, who was the manager of the Yankees at the time, said to me in an interview for this book, he said, everyone talks about like Sandy Alderson and Billy Beane invented this, but it's nothing that Stick wasn't doing at the same time. So that is absolutely part of his legacy.
You know, and there seems to be some parallels between Gene Michael and Cashman, at least, you know, reading this in terms of their relationship with George Steinbrenner.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you could last with George if you, when I say push back, fight back, have you be your own man. Did George respect that enough? That's why these guys were around so long.
Well, I think one of the reasons why George Steinbrenner was such a difficult boss is that yes and no. Sometimes you had to be on your guard and treat him like the king was arriving, and you had to be on your toes and walking on eggshells. But there were a few people, and you pinpointed it, Mike. Gene Michael and Brian Cashman were two of the main ones over the course of Steinbrenner's tenure with the Yankees that could fight back. They earned that respect with him. Steinbrenner knew that they worked hard, knew what they were talking about, knew the game, and they could yell and fight back. Now, that wasn't always enough to create a harmonious environment. And one of the things that I really found here almost unanimously, the people I interviewed, was that George Steinbrenner is a respected figure, but not a beloved one in the people who worked with him. There are not a lot of warm and fuzzy memories of him here. And there was an office culture there that probably gets whitewashed over a little bit when people look back at George Steinbrenner. Even Hal Steinbrenner, his son, told me, people forget how hated my father was in the 80s. So he was a very, very difficult man in that sense, very demanding, very mercurial. And one of the reasons that for all the turnover, as we know, the history with firing and hiring managers, Billy Martin and so many others, and general managers too, one of the reasons that Stick Michael and Brian Cashman hung around was that they could take it. They were tough enough to take the verbal beatings sometimes, and they knew how to pick their spots of when to push back. And you're right, Steinbrenner did respect that to a point. It was still difficult for them.
Yeah, you also talk about a story that has been said, or at least in terms of what they could and couldn't have done, where they could have traded Mariano Rivera at one point, and there was a lot of
Mm-hmm.
pushback, even to when Derek Jeter started playing. And when you look back at this now, or the Paul O'Neill trade, some of these moments in Yankee history that may have looked one way at the time, and you look back and you go, well, of course they made that move. But those things are, when you read them now, the way you present them, were so vital to this franchise for the success they had and how easily it could have gone the other way and changed everything.
That's right, and that's that Gene Michael scouting expertise. You were covering New York sports by 1990, Mike, so you remember Roberto Kelly is the only thing the Yankees had. He was their all-star center fielder, and Gene Michael knew enough to say, that guy's a fourth outfielder on a championship team. Paul O'Neill, he gets on base, he cares, he has all the intangibles. So he made what was an unpopular trade among Yankee fans at the time. And as you said, imagine if they hadn't made a trade like that. Imagine if they had moved Mariano Rivera to replace Derek Jeter with the shortstop from Seattle, Felix Fermin. So that would have been an 0 for 2. And Gene Michael, is arguing against George Steinbrenner. Don't do this. Don't be impatient with these rookies. And Brian Cashman's right there at his side, learning how to pick your battles, how to push back when you had to push back, and of course, vitally, how to evaluate players and listen to people who could evaluate players well and to make those moves. And that's not to say that either of them has a spotless record. Of course, anyone who's in that job for any amount of time is going to make bad trades or trades that they regret. But during that time, of course, and really, if you look at the 30 plus consecutive winning seasons since, they've made the right moves more often than not.
When they moved on from Bob Watson as GM and he took over, I think you said Cashman was 30 at the time.
That's right.
Did people really refer to him inside the building as George Costanza? Did he talk about that?
They did. That was the heyday of obviously the Larry David Seinfeld portrayal of the Yankee offices. And what's interesting about that is that people say that Larry David's stammering, muttering George was spot on. Somehow he got it. That's how George actually acted in the office. Maybe David was a little nicer in his portrayal, but that was basically George. But Cashman was called Costanza because there were superficial similarities. He had the thinning hair at the time, the round glasses that were so popular in the mid to late 90s. And Cashman just kind of laughs that off because he wasn't really a Costanza. He was someone who had confidence back then. He was, even when Steinbrenner offered him the job, Cashman looked at all the people like Bob Watson, who had so much more experience than he had, and were defeated by this difficult man in George Steinbrenner and wanted to get the heck out of there. And Cashman said, I think I can probably handle this because I came up in this environment. Steinbrenner wanted to give him a multi-year contract. Cashman said, no, give me 1 year so I can prove that I can do it. Things like that showed that he may have looked like a Costanza, but didn't act like one. But yes, that was kind of his funny little nickname around the office back then.
Yeah. There's so many great things in this book. And if you're a Yankee fan, and I think you even say, like, even if you're not a Yankee fan and you just know them, sort of like reading about the Patriots now, because they are both, hated by the people outside of it. And I know this is a broad question to ask, but when you did all the work for this book and the Yankee history and even the present, what was the most surprising thing you learned that you put into the book that even somebody like you who's been around it really didn't know about?
That's a great question. The most surprising thing that I learned was that Cashman and Joe Torre actually had their falling out over a relief pitcher named Coulter Bean, who hardly had a cup of coffee in the major leagues. I knew that the two drifted apart. Obviously, Torre's last season managing the team was 2007, and I knew that they weren't as close by the end as they were in the beginning. But the fact that it actually happened over, and this story would take a long time to unspool, so I'll just summarize it here. But basically, in spring training in 2007, Ron Guidry is the pitching coach. Joe Torre is still the manager. High-speed cameras and data and a different way to run a team is starting to come into the front office. And Torre and Guidry said every pitcher throwing a bullpen session in spring training is throwing 30 pitches. And Cashman said that can't possibly be true. How could everybody be throwing the same amount of pitches? So he checks the cameras, and a guy named Coulter Bean, a young reliever who was on a rehab program that spring, throws 80 pitches, which is way more than he should have thrown. Cashman confronts Torre. Torre says, "Are you spying on me?" Cashman says, "You and your coaches are lying to me." And they have a big blow up, and they patched it over a little bit, but it was never the same between them. And for two people that iconic in an era of a franchise that's that iconic to break up over something that seemingly small, I thought it was. I didn't know that until I reported on it, and it sort of reminded me of the way a relationship can break up over the tiniest little thing when it's been fraying for years. So that was one thing I certainly learned.
And you talk about relationships. It's always been interesting, Cashman and Derek Jeter, and you tell the story about Cashman telling him about A-Rod coming to the team. What was that like, him talking about it? And also, what do you think that it's in the past now? He's a retired player. What's that relationship really like now?
Well, they'll never be best friends. They're better off than they were during the grind of being in the same daily, in the same team and having to manage some different interests within that and having to be on different sides of some issues. But yeah, when Cashman actually has it in common with Jeter, that they're both somewhat inscrutable and hard to read. Cashman calls Jeter and says, "We got A-Rod," waits for the response. Jeter just says, "Okay." And that pretty much summarized how he reacted to the whole A-Rod era. This was not a warm and fuzzy relationship between those two either. They had their issues. There was some territorialism within the clubhouse that sprung up. Is this Jeter's team? What does A-Rod mean to the culture of this team? And Cashman would say over the years, you have got to welcome this guy. You're the captain of everyone. Cashman would say, the fans are booing A-Rod. Please tell the fans to lay off. And Jeter would say, it's not my job to tell the fans what to do. Cashman would say, but you told them to stop booing Jason Giambi. And they would have these kind of arguments over the years. And they had a contract dispute later in Jeter's career that really left them with a difficult relationship too. So by the time Jeter retired, those two were not on great terms. When Jeter was being inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2021, Cashman was there to pay his respects. They were certainly on good enough terms for that sort of gesture. And Jeter actually pulled Cashman aside in Cooperstown and said, hey, I get it now. I'm on the other side. At the time, Jeter was an executive with the Miami Marlins. He said, I understand where you're coming from a little bit better. Just want you to know I appreciate what you did for my career. Cashman said, I appreciate that. Thank you. And they had a moment, which is nice, little bit of closure for them. But it wasn't necessarily followed by, let's say, shared family vacations. But they're a little more peace than they used to be.
Yeah, a little bit of Belichick and Brady at the roast there,
Yes.
where they get to say hi. Let's talk about the current teams. You do your work on SNY in New York. People get that on cable, streaming, everywhere. Let's start with the Yankees. Off to a pretty good start. They look good, battling with Baltimore. It's early. How good's this team right now?
I think they're good. And what's impressive or alarming, depending on how a fan wants to look at it, is that they are 9 games over 500 as we speak right now, Mike, and have been in a similar position for most of the season without really firing on all cylinders. Garrett Cole obviously is not there yet. He's out with an injury, working his way back. Aaron Judge has not been Aaron Judge until very, very recently. Giancarlo Stanton doesn't look like he's going to quite be his old self. Gleyber Torres is hitting in the 220s. So the fact that they're still winning with these issues bodes well, unless one wants to be a pessimist and say these things are going to catch up with them eventually. But I think this is a better Yankee team than the one that they've run out there over the past couple of years. They defend better. Bringing in Alex Verdugo to play left field has been a great addition, both in terms of energy and edge and defense. They have obviously Juan Soto in right field, who's really transformed the whole lineup. You talk about that Gene Michael on base percentage approach. It's almost like Juan Soto was designed in a lab to be that guy. He makes the best decisions on whether or not to swing at a pitch than we may have almost ever seen. I'm short of a Barry Bonds or one of the all-time greats. So there have been some key additions. They're winning. They're not quite where they want to be. But I think that they will be there in October, playing with some confidence and some swagger in a way that we maybe haven't seen from Yankee teams over the last half decade. So I think there's reason for at least cautious optimism there.
Yeah, and that's why it appears, again, I'm covering in terms of watching and some highlights and whatever, not covering like you are. It always felt like they were a team built more for the regular season than the playoffs. They could win, they could beat up the bad teams and do it. Do you think it is a little different? You just said maybe make some noise in October. Do they have a little more of that feel this year?
They do, in the sense, Mike, that they've got some confidence. Other than a series against the Orioles where they lost 3 or 4 and had kind of a reality check that there's still some work to do, they're beating just about everybody. The fact that they're running all over the Astros so far this year, even though the Astros are having a down year, that's good for their confidence, because that's obviously been the brick wall that the Yankees haven't been able to get through in Houston for more than a half decade now. So yeah, I do think they'll be going in with more confidence. I think on the nuts and bolts side of it, a team really built for the postseason probably has a little bit deeper and more power arms in the bullpen than what they have. I think they need to shore up that bullpen a little bit. Clay Holmes at the back has been great, but that bridge to him, something they might need to address at the trade deadline. But yes, I think this is a team, because of the additions of your Sotos, your Verdugos, Marcus Stroman, guys who carry a lot of confidence with them. They might be swaggering into October more so than what we've seen the last couple of years, which is a little bit less solid and confident for sure.
I know I'm putting you on the spot here because you cover both teams. And the Mets are 500. They're hanging in there. From a fan perspective, and you deal with both. And social media, as we all know, some fans want you to be honest and critical, others don't. But what do you sense? This is a big picture thing. The
Yeah.
difference between Yankee fans and Met fans when it comes to that.
Well, that's interesting. I think to point out the vast majority of fans that you meet are reasonable, thoughtful, understand what a team is trying to do. So as the years go by and social media becomes less and less like a holistic indicator of how people think, but more like just how people vent their anger, I would say a major caveat I would say is what we see is social media. So there's a lot of anger on from both fan bases right now on that platform, but different kinds of anger. I think Yankee fans are used to so much excellence that an 82 and 80 season or a losing streak, uh, the angry ones among them can really go off, and it's fire Cashman, fire Boone. And the Yankees have been frustrated about the talk about Aaron Boone. They feel like we have a guy who really has a feel for how to manage people and has developed a really good feel for how to manage a game, and the fans just always want him to lose his job. So there's a lot of anger there. With the Mets fans, I would say the anger probably runs, again, online, still a little deeper because they just haven't been able to enjoy the same amount of success. So the hunger is that much more. So the down years hurt that much more. The expectations when they brought in Verlander and Scherzer a year ago got everyone all excited. And now taking a step back again in expectations has left Mets fans that I see not in a great place. But again, I'm really noticing, Mike, I wouldn't be surprised if you notice the same thing, that a gap has opened up between the people you see and they get it, and the people who tweet at you who are the angry ones. So I'll say that.
Uh, I mentioned a couple times the SNY stuff. For people here or anybody watching this, when do they get a chance to see you on SNY talking Mets and Yankees?
Sure, thanks. Baseball Night in New York, 6 p.m. on weeknights. I'm there at least a couple nights a week. And SNY.TV, I'm writing columns and news stories all the time. So that's where you can find me at my day job.
Yes. And again, I'm going to show the book again. Obviously, I used to people say this, you can get the book anywhere, I'm assuming. And you've been out a little bit. We really appreciate you taking some time to talk about it. And I know the people back home are proud of you because you got a local guy down there in New York City covering the two major teams, obviously two of the major teams with all the excitement going on in New York now. So we wish you the best and good luck with the Yankee Way, the book by Andy Martino.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. And I'm not just a Rochester guy, and this is true. I've always been a Channel 13 guy my whole life, all the way back to the early days of being a child and watching Don Elhart and Ginny
Yeah.
Ryan and you. And so I go way back. So it's an honor to be on with you too, truly.
Yeah, Don's a quitter. He's finally quitting. 58 years on the air.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
I thought the day would never come.
It's just happening, but we appreciate that. And thanks very much. And we'll check you out online and certainly on SNY.